Okay, welcome to Unit 7. After this we have 5 sessions left, and we're going to touch on object-oriented programming, or OOP for short. I tend to refer to OOP as Voodoo since I have done the bulk of my coding in procedural-oriented programming, which is what we have been doing to date. I will include any links I gave you in the handout down below the video. The current version of PHP is 7. OOP became a more serious programming method around about version 5, while version 7 of PHP has advanced it further. There are a number of programming languages which support or are object-oriented. These include Java, Python, and C++, though there are others. It is a good idea to have further familiarize yourself with OOP if you wish to enter programming as a career, as it is very heavily used in the software industry. I want to take a look back at one of our Hello World examples. It's a procedural version of the script. And if you look here, I'm just going to start the slideshow. You can see function return my variable empty brackets, and then the opening curly bracket. This is defining our function, and remember that a function sits in our program and does nothing until it is called. And you see here empty brackets. Let's go back, which means that we're passing no variables to our function, which means that everything that we're going to be doing is already embedded in our function, and any values returned, if any, will also be generated here in our function. And in here we generate a variable called $myVariable, which contains the text hello world. And since this is just a simple demo function, we're not really doing anything with what's in here. We return or send back the contents of $myVariable to the calling routine. And then here we're closing or ending the function. And then if you look here where it says echo within quotes myVariable equals dot return myVariable brackets, we're calling the function. Remember that when we want to use a function, we're calling it. With echo, we're simply outputting myVariable equals hello world. Now, let's just take a look and see that run. Just to remind ourselves. And if you look, it says myVariable equals hello world. So let's move on to doing this particular operation the object-oriented programming way. Before I get into that, there are 2 words related to object-oriented programming we need to take a quick look at before we actually dig into the code. The first is class and the second is object. And sometimes it may seem like a programmer is tossing these 2 words around interchangeably, meaning the same thing, but they aren't. Class and object are related to each other, but they mean different things. One common way I have seen class explained is to relate it to a blueprint for a house. It is not the house itself, it simply explains how the house should look or how to build it. And it won't even necessarily describe the color, but it does describe the structure of the basic house. And a class normally contains groups of functions, here called members or member functions in the case of classes, but they are still just functions, just as what we're used to. Member variables, we see up here, are also sometimes called properties, which are basically the same as a variable that we use in procedural code. There's nothing really unique about this at this point, except we do see the term public here, and I'll get into that in a second. An object, on the other hand, is like the house itself, not quite assembled yet, but it does contain the wood, wires, etc. needed to build the house. Different variations of houses can be built from these classes, just as in a blueprint you can build the house that's in there, make minor changes to it or major changes to it, and yet it comes from the same blueprint. Okay, so we'll get to the code now. And by now, some of this shouldn't seem that strange to you. Creating a class is similar in appearance to creating a function. Here we create a class called myClassName. Not entirely original there, but you'll notice that there's no brackets after this other than our standard opening curly bracket and our standard closed curly bracket here. Inside the class we have a property, remember variable, called $myVariable, which contains the text string hello world with an exclamation mark. And we have the tag public in front of it. And then we have a function called returnMyVariable, which looks, other than the word public, very similar to a standard function outside of an object-oriented programming script. And then here we simply return $this arrow myVariable. Very similar, and I'll get into explaining some of the other odds and ends here in a second. This is a very simple function, so just like our procedural version, all we are doing is returning hello world back to the calling function. Now, the term this, $this, followed by a hyphen and a greater than symbol, this actually represents an arrow. It's also called the object operator or just arrow. Refers to everything inside of our class and concurrently everything inside of our object. Just as with a function, the class sits there and does nothing until it is called for. However, the method of calling our methods or functions within our class is just a little bit different. There it is. In order to access a member function, we need to instantiate an instance of the class. That fancy way of saying what we're doing, in essence, is create an object in memory from it. So everything contained within our class gets loaded into an object and stored in memory for access later. So you do that by taking this, which looks like creating a variable, which is sort of what we're doing. And here we've created a variable called $myObject equals new myClassName. So now, once we've done this, the code runs. We have an object called myObject, which contains everything from myClassName. And then here we see echo $myObject arrow return myVariable brackets. And what we're doing here is we're accessing the member function right here. Remember, public function return myVariable. This is what we're accessing here. And in essence, what this is saying is we're going to call or run this function from my object. And we can have multiple instances of my class in different object names. So all it does when the return myVariable is accessed from my object is echo the output. Now if we look at that, it says hello world. So this is just a very different way of doing what we've already done. This is highly organized, and you kind of have to really think about this when you write your code, although you tend to think about the data instead of the code first. Like, it's often referred to that object-oriented programming is bottom-up programming, whereas procedural-oriented programming is top-down. You think about the code first and how you're going to develop the data. In this case, you think about the data and then how you're going to code it. Before I really go on, there are three keywords that I want to talk about. The first one we've seen is called private, or is public, and then I'll get to private in a second. Public, this keyword denotes that a member variable, or property, or method is visible from outside as well as inside the class. Private, on the other hand, this keyword means that the variable, property, or method can only be accessed from directly within the class or its descendants, and this refers to extending a class, which I'll cover in a minute. Protected, which is the third keyword I want to mention, means that a variable, property, or a method is only available from within the originating class, and even classes which extend, which is that inheritance thing again, cannot access them. Now, one thing to say about public, where we see the word public function, return my variable here, this is exactly the same as this. If I take out the word public and we have function return my variable, then at this point in time the word public is assumed by PHP. So this not having the word public in there is exactly the same thing as having the word public there. Our Hello World class, which we're looking at here, the My class name, is a very simple class, so it can't be used for much. In fact, it can only be used for one thing, and that's to print Hello World. Let's look at a more complex example, our old math function. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over the old function as I did for Hello World. I'm just going to go over the new object-oriented version. And where are you? And here we go. So if you look, you'll see class MyMath. And we have private. Remember, private means that this can only be accessed from within class MyMath or another class which extends it. Again, I'll get into extension in a second, or inheritance. So we have private $string results equal 0. And what I'm doing here with these three variables is I'm simply assigning defaults so that in case the routine is called without passing any numbers to it, it actually has something to do. So we have private $string results. This is what we're going to return. We have private $string number 1 equals 2, private $string number 2 equals 2. So this sets up our three defaults. And now we have public function set numbers. So what this routine does is takes a number passed to it and assigns them to these two member variables or properties. Then we have the public function divide two numbers, and public function divide two numbers simply takes two numbers passed to the routine and divides them by each other. And then public function multiply two numbers takes two numbers passed to the routine and multiplies them. Let's go down and look at how we do this. And I have $sign my results equals new MyMath. So we're creating an object from MyMath called $string my results. The second one, we are also creating an object, but this time we're calling it $sign my results 2 equals new math. So here's an example of that, using the same class or the same blueprint to build two different houses. They look similar to each other, but they may have a different color, whatever. So here we see again, we're accessing a member function, set numbers, within the object called myResults, and we're passing 10 and 25 to it. So if we go back to our member function called set numbers, number 1 is going to equal 10, the number 2 here is going to equal 25. So that means that our two variables here, our two member variables, instead of equaling 2, are going to equal 10 and 25. Now we do this again, but now our second object, which is exactly the same as the first one, we're passing the numbers 10 and 25.5 to it. So here again, set numbers 10 and 25.5 means that the number 1 will equal 10, but the number 2 will equal 25.5. Again, remembering that we have two objects, we're not actually now accessing the original class itself. We're actually accessing a virtual copy of it in memory. So printf answer, and then we're printing our answer as a float to 2 decimal places. And here again is our object called $string myResults divide two numbers. So we're accessing this member function, or we are running this function, which is now inside of myResults, and we are going to divide 10 by 25. We see it. Here's that magic this with an arrow designator, and here's another one. You see it several times here. So in essence, what we were saying is results, instead of equaling 0, is going to equal 10 divided by 25. And then we send it back and print it. And then here in the second print line, we are going to again print to 2 decimal places a float, but this time, again, our myResults object, we're going to multiply our same two numbers, so we're going to go right here, 10 times 25. So this, our object now, which now contains number 1 times number 2, so remember we've set number 1 and number 2 to equal 10 and 25, and then we return the results. Now we're accessing our second object, also exactly the same as this, a virtual version of this, except that you may as well say that this is laying there untouched because we're now working with the object instead of the original code here. We again divide two numbers and again multiply two numbers, but instead of 10 and 25, we're now using 10 and 25.5. So let's see what that looks like. Answer is 0.40, answer is 250. So 10 times 25 equals 250. And then down here, 10 divided by 25.5 equals 0.392, and 10 times 25.5 equals 255, which is correct. If you do this a few times, if you look at code and look at what it's doing, it will eventually sink in, and if you look at some of the links that I will provide, it gives a further explanation and further examples. Now I want to go into inheritance now, which is that extension word that I used, where I said that an extended class could access either a method or variable labeled. I said even an extended class could not access either a method or variable labeled with the protected keyword. Well, what is this inheritance or this extended that I was talking about? In essence, inheritance allows a class, now called the child class, to inherit all the functionality of another, called its parent, class. This is a simple way to extend an existing class without having to retype all of the code within it. Now let's go take a look at an example here. And again, we're using our math example here, but I'm just going to extend it. Now here's our original function that's exactly the same as before. There's no difference from that. But now we've got another class. Class new maths extends my math. So we are extending the functionality of my math and not having to retype all the code. So we have private results equals 0. This is basically the same as up here. But now we have a public function called return square root. $number. So we're passing a number to it. And again, here's our mathematical function. So what we were saying is my maths results variable now equals the square root of the number that we have passed to it, and then we return our class's results back to the calling routine. But in this case, unlike the other one where we had created two objects, now we're going to create one object. First of all, let's set a number called square me. And then we have number 1 and number 2, same as before, 10 and 25.5. And now we're going to create a new object called $math object equals new maths, which is this here. Notice that we are not mentioning the class myMath at this point. We set the number, we used set numbers, but here's the interesting thing. New maths doesn't have set numbers in it, but myMath does. The class myMath does. So what we've been able to do now is access set numbers through new maths because we've used the extends keyword. In essence, this becomes like one class rather than two. And we haven't used the protected keyword anywhere in here, so we can access any of the member variables, properties, or member functions within the original class. So if we go down to printf now, printing to 3 decimal places a float divided by another number to 3 decimal places equals an answer to 3 decimal places. So we're simply taking the number 1 and number 2 and printing them here. We're not doing anything with them, and we're not passing them to our classes. But here, $math object, and then divide two numbers. What we've done is now we're referencing our new maths, but we're using divide two numbers from our original myMath class. Again, we're not mentioning myMath here when we create our object. We are using new maths, which accesses it because it is a child of its parent myMath. The same down here for multiplication. We are multiplying, accessing the member function in our object and multiplying two numbers, which we've set through set numbers right here. And then down here we're directly accessing return square root, which is in our class called new maths, which is a child of math. So let's see this run. $10 divided by 25.5 equals 0.392. 10 times 25.5 equals 255. And the square root of 9 is 3. There's that math again, but remember, I'm just using it as an example. If you're not great with math or don't use math, you don't have to worry. Programming isn't all about math. It's only about math if you need it to be. So there we have it for today. If you have any questions that you need answered about the video or anything that's confusing you, I didn't necessarily explain everything in the best way possible, you can consult the links that I will have underneath the video, or you can directly ask me through email or at my office. All right.